I did my PowerPoint presentation on Joan of Arc. The English were slowly defeating France in the Hundred Year War. By 1429, nearly all of northern France was under Anglo-Burgundian control, with the English controlling Paris and Rouen. During the same time, Joan of Arc, a 16-year-old girl who had seen the first-hand horrors of war, was leading the French troops in the siege of Orleans, with the merit that she had received visions from God telling her to drive the English away. Joan of Arc led the French to a momentous victory in the city of Orleans, turning the tide of the Hundred Year War away from the English and towards the French, while also becoming the focus point of English fear and anger. Joan of Arc's explosive rise to power and success as a 19-year-old woman in the 1400s has been discussed for centuries. Joan's supposed ethereal powers of having religious visions make her story mysterious and inaccessible. Some historians completely write out the visions as they can't accurately be described, as there isn't any evidence. The conditions that Joan of Arc grew up in are important to discuss as they served as the bitter backdrop to her short but eventful life. Nearly all the fighting that occurred in the Hundred Year War was in France. The time that Joan of Arc grew up in largely suited who she was. Growing up in a border region of France, her town was subject to raids and pillages, with the English army use of Travois tactics. Having her first vision at the age of 16, this vision inspired her to fight at her king's side like her word rules her to. Joan of Arc's intervention in the Hundred Year War helped turn the tide of victory away from England and towards France. Joan of Arc single-handedly became the English's focus point of their fear and anger by defeating them several times in battle. It can be easy to interpret that Joan of Arc was viewed as a divine savior or as someone who has ethereal powers, but first and foremost, Joan of Arc was a captain and a soldier who led the French to victory multiple times. She lived in a political world of intrigue, court factions, and complex dynastic relationships that provided the backdrop for her military success and her downfall. Her career as a soldier is more complex than meets the eye. She wasn't just someone who had divine talks with God and then defeated the English with divine powers, but rather Joan of Arc lived in a complex world with difficult issues such as limited rights for women. It's easy to reduce Joan of Arc to being a saint or assigning her powers to divine intervention, but by characterizing her that way, it ignores her strength of character. Whether or not she'd heard divine voices, she had to accomplish two goals: raise French morale and frighten the English, and she did both better than anyone expected. Joan of Arc was captured in 1430 by the Burgundians, afterwards being sold to the English for 10,000 livres. She was transferred to Rouen and then placed on trial for heresy before a court held by a supporter of the English. The following hostile interrogations on Joan of Arc by the English gives a deeper look at Joan of Arc's character and become extremely impressive after considering that Joan was not an educated aristocrat, but rather a peasant. It became clear that the English's hatred against Joan completely drove the trial. The interrogators were constantly attempt to trap Joan in difficult answers and try to get her to say the wrong thing, such as asking her about the saints that she saw in her visions, asking her what gender they were, did they have hair, and what language they spoke. She was eventually executed, but this execution was a foregone conclusion. The minute that she was sent to Rouen, it was decided that she would be executed, as she embarrassed the English, being a 19-year-old woman. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the old marketplace in Rouen. In conclusion, Joan was ultimately a soldier and a captain who victoriously led the French to defeat the English multiple times, turning the tide of the war in France's favor. This was mainly done by Joan's strength of character, bold leadership, and native intelligence rather than any supposed ethereal powers. The interrogations that Joan faced before her execution made it clear that her rise to power and success wasn't caused by luck or divine intervention, but rather by her extreme desire and willingness to accomplish her goals. And that's the end, and this is my bibliography.